So thank you so much for making the time to spend with us this afternoon, and we're just thrilled to learn more from you. So I will turn things over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me first. I would like to start off by saying that the Piedras Blancas breeding colony has a very special place in my heart. I did some early work there in 2012 through 2014, and you're also lucky to be able to work in such a unique habitat for these seals. And these types of talks with people who already are convinced that elephant seals are great are my favorite because I don't have to spend half the talk convincing you of that. You already know. And it's one of my favorite types of talks because people are so enthusiastic. So I do hope I leave time for questions at the end. And I will ask, maybe whether or not my videos are playing well when I do play them, and let me know if they're a little bit slow and I might skip over them depending on how the bandwidth is going. So I changed the title of my talk because I realized that it's not just about young males. It's really about all the males. I'm going to try and cover some of the foundational work that we've done up at the Año Nuevo breeding colony. And for those of you who haven't visited there, it's wonderful. It's where I've done most of my research. And I'm going to share just some snippets, some fun facts, and some takeaways that I hope you will be able to share with the general public when you are interpreting and educating everyone else about this incredible species. But yeah, I'll just get started by saying that I adore elephant seals. I know I sound like a broken record probably for most of you who already adore elephant seals, but I think that they're one of the most incredible animals for studies specifically of behavior because you can actually see what they're doing. And I think we take for granted as people who love elephant seals, the fact that most seal species breed underwater, right? So out of all the other faucid or true seal species, including harbor seals or bearded seals or leopard seals, a lot of times we don't even know what they're doing. And so it's very difficult to understand the communication system of these animals because most of their behavior is occurring beneath the water surface. Elephant seals are remarkable because everything is happening on land. And so I've sort of built my career around testing and exploring the social lives of these seals as I see them every day, and trying to ask questions that you wouldn't be able to ask with other species that breed aquatically, and maybe use them kind of as a window into the secret lives of seals. So I'm going to review, for those of you who are not familiar with the northern elephant seal history, but for most of you, hopefully it'll be, just a review of this topic. But, the fact that northern elephant seals are here today at all is a complete miracle, because they were nearly hunted to extinction in the late 1800s. And so as people arrived to California in search of gold, they, along with the whales along this coastline, decimated marine mammal species to render their blubber for oil, right? So the population was basically reduced to very, very few individuals extremely quickly, such that by 1890, the only remaining animals within the population were found on Isla de Guadalupe, which is a small island about 150 nautical miles off the shore of Baja. And so there was a small subset of individuals that were actually discovered by this guy named Townsend, who worked for the Smithsonian Institute. And instead of, leaving them alone, he of course killed them and took them into collections, as many of us have read in our booklets about elephant seals. And so they were redeclared extinct. And then in 1924, the Mexican government found a few more on this island and then protected them. And since then, their population has completely rebounded, which we're all very aware of. So they, went up to the islands first that they historically had colonized, but then they spilled over onto the land colonies because there were no longer land-based predators. So as of 2014, which was the last range-wide census, there's more than 210,000 animals. And we believe that their population is increasing about 3 to 4% a year. However, because of this extreme genetic bottleneck of the animals being reduced to so few individuals, they retain a very low genetic variability. In fact, it's very difficult until very recently with new genetic techniques to tell the difference between individuals. And we just now have the technology to be able to do that. So now they breed along dozens of sites along California, in Mexico, and now we're expanding even up into Oregon and Washington. And I've heard of a few seals hauling out up in Vancouver. So they're everywhere, which is great. So this story is really about how this young pup, who was a male, grows up and becomes one of these big dominant animals, and what it takes and what the social lives of males in particular are like. And so I hope to tell this story and highlight some of the interesting findings that we've explored about male elephant seals. The reason that I love male elephant seals in particular is because everything about them is just so extreme. They have a shorter lifespan, right, comparatively with females. They go, like females, on these extreme migrations, potentially to more dangerous environments in order to acquire more resources along the continental shelf. And really the competition between these guys, as all of you have seen during the breeding season, is just so intense, and so few males actually reach it to this alpha status. And so I think of their behavior as just fascinating. And so that's why I focus on male elephant seals in particular. Some early work revealed that less than 10% of males ever even reach adulthood. And of that, less than 5% become breeding males. So when you're talking about, these alpha males who are actually contributing to the gene pool, very, very few of them are attaining that status. And so it's really interesting to think, well, what does it take to become one of these successful males? And also, how does this breeding system additionally impact the low genetic diversity that's already present because of this extreme population bottleneck? So as you know, this is kind of a blurry picture and it's a little bit old, but just to review, males will go up to the continental shelf on their long foraging migrations all the way up to the Aleutian Islands. Females are this yellow line and they go out into the Pacific. So you see this sexual segregation in terms of foraging behavior. And we know that as they are out there in the ocean, males and females are likely encountering predators such as great white sharks and killer whales. And so I'll just start off by saying, every time that you've seen a male on the beach, remember the incredible journey that he has taken to be there. First of all, just surviving in general and reaching an adult status is an incredibly amazing task for a male elephant seal. So I always like to pay my respects at the beginning of the season and say, great, you made it back another year. Good job surviving. So as many of us know, or all of us know, they're one of the most sexually dimorphic species in the world, right? We know that females can grow to be 9 to 12 feet long and weigh between anywhere 900 to 1,800 pounds and can live up to their early 20s. And we don't know very many males at our breeding colony that have lived past 14 years old. And our largest males that we've measured have weighed upward of 5,000 pounds. And so this is incredible sexual dimorphism. And one of the first questions that I generally get from the public is, well, why do you see such extreme sexual dimorphism in the species? And it really has to do with the level of competition that's observed between males. So anytime you see a difference between male and female animals, it's usually, or it is a result of sexual selection, right? So it's either advantageous to be different if you're a male in terms of male-male competition. So maybe you have more weaponry, and so you're able to compete more with other males. Maybe you have big horns, or in the case of elephant seals, are very large, and that serves in competition with other male individuals, or alternatively, females like those traits, right? So like in some species of songbird or birds of paradise, they have beautiful feathers or songs because females select for that. In the case of the northern elephant seal, though, we know that females exhibit very little selection, probably none, of male elephant seals. And so the secondary sexual characteristics that we're all familiar with, this calloused chest shield and this big nose and this big size, are all a result of intense male-male competition. And it's important to note that a lot of other seal species don't exhibit this intense sexual dimorphism, right? So in some cases, females are actually bigger than males, or males and females are difficult to distinguish, like in harbor seals. And that's because breeding occurs primarily underwater, right? And it's difficult for males to monopolize multiple females underwater if they're very big, or have a lot of drag from their nose, for example. So in a lot of cases, it's not advantageous to have these secondary sexual characteristics underwater, and females can't be monopolized, right? Like one male can't guard hundreds of females underwater because of the nature of the three-dimensional environment. However, on land, everything changes. So this is actually from Arroyo Laguna. Am I saying that right? Or is it Arroyo Seco? I always mix them up. This is a beach at Piedras Blancas that
Laguna. Yeah.
Laguna, thank you. Arroyo Seco, I think, is a racetrack up near where and this is, a typical site for elephant seals, right? In which you have multiple females hauling out together in groups. And then you have these big alpha males who are in charge, right? And they beat off or tolerate these beta males who are also adults, right? These are breeding age, highly competitive individuals who the alpha is constantly chasing around and trying to beat back from their harems or groups of females. And then of course you have these pesky peripheral males who are usually subadult animals, not quite socially mature, but certainly motivated to get in on the action. And a good alpha will often tolerate a couple of beta males because the beta males will control all of these pesky peripheral males. And then it's worth noting that the alpha will go wherever the females will go, right? So it's not territory defense. They're not guarding boundaries around the sand. They're moving with the females. So if all these females move down to be close to the water's edge, guess what? This alpha is going with them. So it's really interesting and different from other pinniped species like California sea lions, who have a territory and they say, this is my rock and don't cross this rock or else I'm going to bite you. The male is actually guarding the females. That's the resource that's really important to them. So our program at UC Santa Cruz is really focused on evaluating the individual lives of seals and tracking their development and ultimately their success as males throughout their lifetimes. So I've been a part of this project since 2009, and we've gone out every season and have tracked these individual animals, some of them from birth, to sort of see what it takes to be an elephant seal and what are some of the challenges that they face and how do they overcome those challenges. And so my partner in this work is Dr. Colleen Reichmuth, who some of you may know, and she and I have been running this program together since the early or mid 2000s. So I have a general approach for this research that I'll share with you. The first one, which you are all familiar with, is the use of identification and tags, right? And so our tags at Año Nuevo are green, and yours are white, and there's lots of different colors for different sites. And usually we put about 300 tags in pups when they're born as part of an effort to assess sort of the success really of mothers and their pups, and we weigh each of the pups every year. So we weigh 300 pups, they get tags, half of them are male, half of them are female. And so you can imagine how few adult males actually have tags when we come to study them and get to know them. So we've been actually going out and tagging males as they are a little bit older to increase our sample size for this project. And so in addition to tagging them, we place these alphanumeric marks, or in this case, a numeric mark that matches the tag code on their rear flanks with black hair dye. And this is just some examples of if they are not tagged, but we find them really interesting and we want to get a tag on them, we'll often mark them with just kind of a random code that we later convert to their tag number. And then here's just an example of, and tell me if this video skips, and I'll skip my videos if the bandwidth is too low. But this is just an example of us tagging a young, or marking a young individual. So you can kind of see it. I can see it skipping a little bit, maybe. But you get the general sense. And that mark stays on there until they come back in the summer to molt their skin and fur during their molting season. And then we have to remolt them or remark them again. So it's a continual effort, but it allows us to observe the animals from a greater distance and incur less disturbance on the colony. Yep. Don't want to play that again. And so, as I mentioned, we've been tagging older individuals. Some people might ask, well, how do you tag a male elephant seal who is not chemically immobilized? And we do so very carefully while they sleep. We use these tagging shears that are cattle tagging shears, and you have one person who gently pulls apart their rear flippers and another person who comes in and tags very quickly. We've become really good at this. Our success rate is very high because we're very selective on which males actually get these tags, but it's really important, right? Because it allows for between year identification of males, which is important for some of the questions that we're asking about what it takes to be a male elephant seal and grow up and become successful. Additionally, we do a lot of recite work where we essentially go out every day and just see who is where on the colony and what they're doing. And so every time we encounter one of our study animals, we take a GPS position of their location. And we do this every day to get a general sense of how they move throughout the colony. So have you ever wondered, like, oh, is this subadult that I see here today, is he always here? Like, is this his beach, or does he move around from all across the entire colony every day? Or does this individual alpha, does he come back to this exact same location every year? And those are the types of questions that we can answer by just simply collecting a GPS position for individual animals every day that we're out on the beaches. We do this with minimal disturbance, and we try to get as close to the animal so we can get an accurate GPS reading for them. And this is just an example of what that looks like. And from these data, you can do some really interesting things, right? So the purple outline that you see here is just the available habitat that the elephant seals could use, that have been used historically by elephant seals at the Año Nuevo breeding site. And the darker purple or kind of bluish coloration is the estimated home range of this adult male. So you can see that this particular individual within the season had one sighting that was way up here, but for the most part, he concentrated his distribution to a very small area. And we find that this is something that's true of older animals. Older animals tend to stick to a smaller site and don't tend to spread out over greater distances over the course of the breeding season. Alternatively, here's a GPS recites from a younger animal. So you can see he was kind of all over the place, and then a lot of his recites were down here, but younger animals tend to roam a lot. They like to kind of check out different opportunities around the colony and don't necessarily begin to stick with a particular harem until they get older, which I'll talk more about. It's super interesting. And then, of course, we score competitive interactions in the field, and this just requires us to stand up on dunes and observe the natural interactions between competing males that are occurring throughout the day. And so anytime we see two individual males interact, we note down a lot of information about that interaction. So this includes things like, in this case, the animal, oops, I'll play this video really quick of the types of interactions that we were seeing this year. This is a fight that we observed early on in the season between two very well-known individuals, D211, who is a 4-year returning animal at this very small location on the north end of the park, and 5073, who is an animal who was born at Año Nuevo, who is now 13 years old and became an alpha this year. And it's a little skippy, but in this case, we were really interested to see who would actually win this battle between these two competing individuals, because there are animals that were familiar with each other from previous years. And in case, spoiler alert, this guy on the right ended up winning that fight. Oops. Okay, so when we're scoring an interaction, we want to know who the winner is, who the loser is, whether or not they vocalize, the total distance moved by each individual. And all of this information is really important because we use it to effectively assign quantitative ranks to each male within our study location. And so the way that we do this is by applying this ELO rating approach, which was originally developed for two-player games like chess. And it calculates the relative probability of one individual beating another. So everybody at the beginning of the season, all the animals within our study will start out with an equal score, right? Because we don't know who's dominant. So everybody starts out with 1,000. And then every time we see an event where there's a winner and a loser, the scores of those individuals get adjusted based on the probability that they would have won that interaction to begin with. So if I'm a very subordinate animal, for example, and I beat a very dominant animal, my score goes way up because the likelihood that I was going to win that interaction was very low. And so at the end of the season, what you have is a really nice way to assign a quantitative score to each male, such that, you can see here, GL, we know he was very dominant, but he also had the highest score. And then less dominant individuals have lower scores. So it's just a way to verify our descriptive rankings like alpha, beta, and peripheral males. And some of the cool things that we find from these observations is that really fighting is quite rare. So, right, only 6% of fights or altercations actually lead to any contact between individuals, right? So most of the time, as most of you have probably seen, they're sitting up calling, maybe doing a little bit of body chest slamming, and then one individual is usually running away, right? Less than 2% ever end in a sustained fight. So this is a fight that lasts for more than 5 seconds. And so most of the time, even if they do touch, they are not actually competing or engaging in these really rigorous bloody battles like the one I just show you, even though this is the reputation that males have as being very gruesome and bloody sometimes in their interactions. And what I found most interestingly is that in 73% of all interactions, the winner will vocalize. And so that begs the question, so why don't they fight more? Why aren't male elephant seals fighting a ton during the breeding season? And why do they substitute in a lot of cases calling with fighting? And that's because it just takes so much dang energy, which all of you know, right? And so a male northern elephant seal is hauled out on the beaches. Sometimes they're up to 3 months without access for food or water. And they certainly do not want to be running around like lunatics on the beach, wasting all that precious energy. Yes, sorry, that was for emphasis. And in some cases, we have seen on very rare occasions, these fights actually lead to death. So this is a case of a male older individual who had a canine tooth that actually, you can see right here, went through his skull, which was really unfortunate. I've seen this happen a few times over the past decade or so, but it is something obviously that is not ideal for these males. And so they'd like to avoid all that physical excursion if possible. I'm going to skip that video because I think it will skip. And so males don't fight that much, but instead move one another with their calls. And so here's an example of a male sitting up and calling, and then this other individual in the forefront is going to move away. The call is, it's like a pulse. And so hopefully you can hear it in the background. And then that guy's going. So that's way more effective, right, than having to fight that individual. And so this is really interesting. Here's just an example of a beautiful male calling. So many questions though, right? Particularly from this last video, which is like, what type of information is contained within the signal that lets this individual know or motivates this individual to move away? And that is what I spent a lot of time thinking about and researching, right? Because there's a few different hypotheses that you could think of. One is, well, this male has call characteristics that signify size, right? That are size related, or maybe dominance related. So maybe bigger males or more dominant males have lower frequency calls or longer calls, or maybe he calls louder when he's more motivated to fight. And so that's like much scarier, kind of like a dog who barks louder, you might be more alarmed by. Alternatively though, maybe this call is a signature, right? So maybe this call is unique to this animal and this male knows that guy and he hears his special call and goes, well, I don't know if I want to fight with that individual today. That's Sam, we fought previously, and so I'm going to back away. Lots of interesting hypotheses to test here. And so I set out to kind of evaluate what the information that was contained within these specialized signals, and specifically what they actually mean to listeners. And so the objectives for this first study that we conducted was just simply noting, are there actually reliable differences in the acoustic displays of male northern elephant seals? And so, you know, do males produce calls that are different from one another, at least the adults? And then if so, are these differences meaningful to rivals? And so our approach, in addition to the ones that I already mentioned, we collected a lot of acoustic recordings from individual males at the site. These included kind of calls taken from a further distance with a directional microphone, which is what we have up here on the top panel. And then this recorder here that Dr. Southall is using is a recorder that measures the amplitude of a male. And fun fact for all you elephant seal lovers, male elephant seals are the loudest animal in air on land, louder than bonobos and lions. And we just published a paper last year about the amplitude of a male's call. And for those of you who have been very close, you know it's very loud. So they are incredibly loud. But in order to measure how loud they are, you have to stand 1 meter away from the source, which is why he's so close here. So these are just two different recording approaches that we use in the field. And so we identified at this site adult males, right? And we observed their competitive interactions and we recorded their calls multiple times so that we could do an in-depth analysis and measure certain call characteristics of each of their calls to see whether or not it was correlated to their dominant status, for example. And this is just another nice picture of a male elephant seal calling. It's important to note that you can't get male northern elephant seals to call on demand. I once had a researcher from Italy come and say, well, let's just walk up to him and scare him and get him to call. But the calls produced by male elephant seals are part of this multimodal display, right? They sit up at this very specific posture and they emit this call. Sometimes they'll slam their body against the sand to produce a vibrational cue. And so it's not possible to just get them to call. A lot of times you're sitting around waiting for them to call, either at one another, or in this case, I think this male was just arriving at the beach, sort of announcing his presence to the other males who are at the site. And this is what it looks like to record these guys. I try to remain below the threshold of disturbance for females because they can override your recorder because they're very loud and protective of their pups, which you don't want to get a female call on your recording because they're very loud. And these are just some more photos of that process. Okay, so what did we find? So these are calls produced by 3 different, very dominant males. And there's a few things to point out, but first I'll just orient you to what we're looking at here. This is a spectrogram, right? So down here on the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have frequency. And then the colors note kind of the intensity of that call at specific frequencies. Basically, what frequency is the call loudest at? So from these, you can see, okay, there's not all, the calls aren't very loud at, you know, up here at 12 kilohertz. Most of the energy is pretty low. And we know that they're low frequency calls, right? They're lower than the sounds of our voices, for example. And so I'm going to play you these 3 different examples. And I just think they're so incredible how different they are. So here's 3C. Okay, really nice staccato, long pauses in between each pulse. Here's 10A. Continuous burping sound, right? No pauses in between. He's just sort of going for it. And then here is my favorite male of all time, X579. has a nice flourish at the end. Really interestingly, so these calls are stable within a male regardless of the context that they're emitted. So whether or not they are in a fight or they are calling alone over some females, or if they're just in the bushes, these calls are incredibly stable among adults. They're also stable between years. And so you can identify an individual male between years just based on the characteristics of his call, which is pretty interesting. Here's another way to look at it. So these are all the different males that we measured different acoustic characteristics by. And you can actually divide out males based on just two features of their vocalization. One is a temporal feature, which is their pulse rate, which is basically the tempo of their call. And another is a spectral feature, which just has to do with like the predominant frequency that they call at. So each of these little dots represents the call of an individual male in acoustic space. And the only thing I want to represent here is that they're very different from one another, right? They're kind of spread out. And also these little circles around them represents the standard deviation within an individual, meaning that they are very stable within individuals. These circles are really small, right? So S1 always sounds like S1 and he doesn't deviate from this sound ever. So this was really cool. So to answer our first question, yes, the calls of male elephant seals are individually unique. We did a really in-depth analysis exploring the relationship between these call features and dominant status and also size. So we ended up doing a lot of measurements of males using photogrammetry analysis, where we had like a calibrated stick that was in the photo, and then we took length estimates and width estimates of that individual in the field. So at the end, we had kind of these nice morphometric features that we see. We wanted to know whether or not they were correlated with these acoustic parameters. And there were no dominance, there's no dominance information that's related to the specific call parameters that we measured, or size information. So you can't necessarily tell how big or dominant a male is based on the contents of his call. Interesting. Could talk a lot about that, but so are there reliable differences in the acoustic displays of male northern elephant seals? Yeah, they possess really strong individually unique vocal signatures, and the calls are very reliable for an individual within and also between seasons, and they don't seem to reflect motivational state, or how willing they are to fight. However, we don't know still what extent this information is used by listeners. So we really need to test whether or not males can perceive differences in the calls of different males and respond differentially based on those call characteristics. So we adopted a very broad experimental design that was actually derived from studies of birds. Where you essentially play back an acoustic stimuli to an animal to test their behavioral response, and you measure it, right? And so, for example, we would take the call of an individual. This is 1C. We recorded his call, and we composed a playback track with 3 calls from this individual, spaced by about 3 seconds in between. We hooked it up to a speaker, and then we placed it about 7 meters away from a target individual that we wanted to test the behavioral response of. This was our general kind of design. And so we wanted to know whether or not individual males would respond differentially to familiar dominant and subordinate rivals. So could they tell the difference and kind of react in the similar manner that we had seen them do in the field multiple times? So for example, we took a familiar male. He was a mid-ranking beta male, 16R. If we played him the call of his most dominant rival, 2S, would he retreat from the speaker? This is what we predicted, because this is what he always did when he encountered 2S's call. Or alternatively, if he heard the call from his most familiar subordinate rival, 11R, would he approach the speaker? And so we selected 10 individuals, and they received 2 playback treatments based on who their most familiar dominant and subordinate rivals were. So let's take a look. This is what it actually looks like in practice. We have very strict criteria for how we set up a playback experiment. So the animal has to be awake. He has to be on his stomach. The speaker has to be the quote unquote closest animal to him. He can't be interacting with other individuals on the beach, because it's very hard to do these types of experiments in the wild. So you have to control as many variables as possible. We're over here hiding. We can't really hide at this location because it's all beach, but we're trying to kind of have a low profile over here. Yeah, there's our target animal and the speaker. Okay, that's us. Okay, so let's take a look at this video. This is 16R receiving his most familiar dominant rival's call. This was done in 2011, so the video is a little bit grainy. The speaker's here, and here's the animal. It's a little bit skippy, I apologize for that. But he essentially runs away. That's the major gist of it. So in this particular video, I'll sort of narrate what happens. There's no other animals within this area. It's just the sound of his most familiar dominant rival's voice. And he moves approximately 10 elephant seal body lengths away from that sound, which is interesting. We wanted to test also whether or not he was just a big wimp. I'm just going to pause and I'll narrate what happens because I think the video is having some difficulty with the internet connection, but essentially the speaker is here. We play him his most familiar subordinate rival. He takes a minute, he pauses, he listens, and he ends up calling and moving dramatically towards the speaker and sort of almost runs it over. So we know that he's not just a wimp, right? He is retreating when he hears somebody who's dominant and attacking when he hears somebody subordinate. And so this is what we predicted, you know, that basically when males heard the calls of their dominant rivals, they would run away and vice versa. And then this is what our actual results revealed. So phonotaxis is just the amount of distance moved for each male. And so when the caller was subordinate, they approached, you know, quite a bit. And when it was dominant, they ran away quite a bit. So it showed significant movement patterns in the predicted directions in response to their familiar competitors, right? And so this was across 10 individuals. So interesting, right? So they can listen and respond, first of all, just to the acoustic stimuli themselves alone, which I thought was really cool. You don't need the visual representation of the male to be there in order to have an appropriate behavioral response. It's just the sound of his voice. However, in order to really be sure that there wasn't some secret information conveying, you know, size or dominant status in the calls that we had missed with our initial analysis, the only way you could test this was to go to a separate location, play back those same calls to individuals who had never directly interacted with those rivals. And if they responded identically to the same animals, to the animals at Año Nuevo, well, then, you know, it doesn't take experience with that individual to respond that way. There must be something inherent about that call that's giving them appropriate information to either run or attack. Conversely, if they don't respond, then it means that social knowledge is important in terms of learning how to understand and to respond to these special signals. And so we went to Piedras Blancas and we measured the dominance behavior of animals at this site. And we picked 10 beta mid-ranking males after doing behavioral observations here. We marked them and we played them back the same calls that the males at Año Nuevo had received. The only difference was that they had never interacted with those individuals. And so interestingly, this was their response. They didn't respond. They sort of sat up and they looked. They were very aware of it, but they didn't either attack or retreat, which indicates to me that they needed additional information in order to know how to respond. So they didn't move in the predicted directions based on what we had seen up at Año Nuevo. So in summary for this project, males produce individually distinctive vocal signatures during the breeding season. This is similar to human names or to dolphin whistles, although dolphin whistles are produced in an entirely different context, but they're very similar to basically male names. These signals function to control the movements of familiar rivals with minimal costs of conflict, right, which is so important during the breeding season as they're trying to conserve energy. And they don't convey information about size or dominant status or willingness to fight. And I think what is the most impressive part of this story is that males are remembering the identity of their rivals based on these specific call features that have been associated with previous interactions with that individual. And they're keeping track of upwards of 40 different individuals at the Año Nuevo breeding site at a time, which means that they have incredible memories. So one of the projects I'm interested in pursuing is evaluating how the density at different breeding sites varies and whether the number of competitors that a male encounters is different, right? And are there more? And how does that influence their call characteristics? So that's something that I would love to explore. If you're interested in checking out details of this paper, I can send it to you if you email me. It was published in 2015, and it kind of summarizes all of this work. And so for the last part of this talk, I'm going to talk about some of my favorite guys, these young males. And it's like, what are they doing? And how is it that they acquire these very special signals as adults? And do they have them when they're young, or do they sort of develop them throughout their lifetimes? So we know among adult males, dominance relationships are maintained through individual recognition. That's kind of what we just talked about, right? So this male here needs to keep track of all of these competitors during the breeding season. And so each male produces his own unique call. But we don't really know if this is the case for younger individuals. And do younger individuals also have to have unique calls? And also, what is the social network, or what is what are the social relationships like of these young males? Are they stable? Are they sort of fluid? We didn't really have a clear idea of what that was like. So I just like to highlight, while all these males are having these epic battles and chasing one another and breeding, these young guys are at Año Nuevo doing this. And hopefully you can see it. They're basically just messing around. A lot of mock fighting and playing. A lot of silly calls. I think they're silly. They're just kind of all over the place. Yeah, so it's like, what's going on here? First of all, what is this call? How consistent is it? And who are these guys, and how well do they know one another? So more recently, we set out to kind of characterize the behavior of different aged males in this respect. And so this is how we break down our age classes at the Año Nuevo site. We call them subadult ones through adults. It's basically based on secondary sexual characteristics like the length of the nose, if it's touching the ground, the development of the chest shield, the indentation up here, this mid-nose indentation, and also the development, and the pinking and scarring of the chest shield. And so we did this cross-sectionally, meaning that we didn't, for this study, track individual males throughout their lifetimes. We tracked different age groups of males and compared them. We're currently working on tracking individual males, but we keep losing them. So it takes a long time to do, and it takes a while for them to become adults. So we took a similar approach to the previous work for this study, right? We individually identified all of these young males. We did GPS resites, we observed behavioral interactions, and we obtained acoustic recordings, but this time really focused less on the adults and more on these subadult age classes. And so one of the questions that we wanted to ask was, what are the spatial patterns like of individual males across these age classes? And what are their just kind of timing of arrival, and how long are they here for? And so in terms of time spent ashore, it's really interesting. So as animals get older, the time that they spend ashore increases, which makes a lot of sense, right? If you're a big male, you have a lot of energy reserves, and so you have more capacity to stay on land for longer periods of time. These young guys, these 4-year-olds, are actually present in November and leave before the breeding season really kicks off. And they're here for a relatively short period of time. So this here is just time spent ashore measured in days and broken down by age class. We also looked at their home range. So if you recall that map with the purple, we wanted to just know kind of what space are they occupying over the course of a single breeding season. And so the SA1s occupy a very small area, which is interesting. At the Ana Nueva site, they essentially stay in these very small playgrounds. But in these other age classes, they occupy a fairly huge range when they're younger. And as they get older, they sort of zero in on one particular harem or one kind of region that they end up staying at. So when they become an adult, a lot of these guys are really fixed to a particular location. Where these SA2s, these kind of 5 or 6-year-old guys who seem really annoying, they are really annoying. They're basically cruising around the entire colony, just looking for a chance to mate anywhere, and haven't really spent that much time in one location getting to know the other players on that scene, probably because they're not very competitive yet. So these are just some general patterns that we observed, right? So as individuals mature, their home range decreases while their time ashore increases. And males that are older than SA3 have the temporal and spatial opportunity to interact with one another on the breeding colony. So that just means that these guys are here for a similar amount of time and potentially in kind of a condensed location with one another in order to form potentially these dominance relationships with one another. The SA2s and the SA1s are not really part of the dominance hierarchy. Another thing that we did is we took those social relationships that we talked about based on observations of male-male competition, and we created these cool networks. And so what you're looking at here are individual nodes. So each male is represented by a black dot, and then the relationship between individual males is represented by these gray arrows. And then the colors represents the age class. So for example, this guy here has interacted, I don't have the color key up here, but I think with a couple SA2s and SA3, but not really a lot of adults. This guy here interacts with lots of other SA1s. So it's just a cool way to kind of represent the social relationships of males based on their age classes. And what we wanted to measure for each of these different age classes was how many social partners do they have? So how many dudes are they kind of interacting with during the breeding season? And also how well do they know these guys? Which we measured as the total number of times these pairs of males we measured or we saw interact with one another. And this is just called nodal strength. So we did this for each of the different age classes of males and found some interesting patterns. So the strength of association and number of partners between males actually increases as males get older. So you can see among SA1s, these young individuals, they don't have a lot of social partners and their bonds aren't terribly strong. However, the complexity of these relationships become really intense. And I should note that the bigger individuals are more dominant individuals. And so this guy here happened to be an alpha and he had the most number of interactions observed. And so, yeah, it just kind of is an interesting way to demonstrate kind of how these social relationships develop as males age. And then this is the entire network. So if you were to kind of mesh everything together, this is what it would look like. So your takeaway just from this visualization is that young males interact with fewer individuals and generally avoid older animals, which makes sense, right? You don't want to be a 6-year-old interacting with an adult. You don't see any red on his screen here. And then mature males exhibit greater connectivity to and familiarity with their partners, meaning that they're operating in a very dynamic yet very familiar social network. So those guys that you're seeing at the beaches, they really know one another within a season, and we're starting to test how well they know each other across seasons as well. And then finally, their calls change very dramatically as they get older. I'm going to throw up a lot of waveforms here, and I'm just going to walk you through it. So now what you're looking at here is time on the x-axis, and this is just amplitude on the y-axis. So these are like little individual pulses produced by this little SA1 male. I'm going to play you an example of a call, 2 calls from the same individual male who's very young. So this is a 4-year-old SA1 male. Okay, sort of unstructured. and a lot shorter, right? So the takeaway here is that these young males are producing calls that are not highly repeatable. They're not stereotyped. They're really all over the place. And then once you hit about the SA3, SA4, you start to see kind of this crystallization of a male's call. It becomes much more identifiable. And interestingly, this is when we begin to see this differentiation between individual males. So all SA1s basically sound very similar to one another. They all kind of produce these, you know, sort of prepubescent calls. But once you hit this SA4 status, now listen to them. Really nice, right? And this is him again on a different day. Sounds pretty similar to me. So I could probably learn to recognize this guy over multiple days, especially if he sounded different from his neighbor who sounded like this. That's actually 10A again from that earlier spectrogram that I showed you. Right? So the takeaway here is that as males mature, their calls become much more stereotyped, yet different from one another. And this really happens at about the 7 to 8-year-old age, which is really when they're actually becoming fairly competitive and big and able to sort of have any chance of reproducing within this system. So if you want more information on this, we just published this paper at the end of last year, and I'd be happy to send it to you as well, but it has sort of more of the methods and some more details about this. And so that's it. I just wanted to sort of give a highlight of some of our findings having worked at this site for so long. I can't stress the value of sort of these long-term research projects where you can actually track individual animals within and between breeding seasons. I feel very lucky to work at this site, and I'm very interested in projects occurring at different breeding locations as well. So I would love to come down and see you all again. And I wanted to just make sure I left some time for questions because I know that I didn't give an opportunity for that. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and I hope that you learned something today about males that you can share with the visitors at the Piedras Blancas colony.